So why is the world green? That's the big question of the day. If wherever you are in your home, take a look out a window and tell me, just take a look at the window and make sure that you're looking at, you know, some kind of garden or whatever you're looking out at. And how much of that, percentage-wise, is green? So what is the percent coverage outside your home of plants? The percent coverage, just of what you can see. And we use the percent coverage as a way to quantify how many plants there are in a given area. So we might be looking at particular types of plants, or we might be looking at trees in general, understory in general, or leaf litter in general. So what kind of estimate did you come up with? You can write in the chat if you like. What percentage of the area that you can see from your window is green? And you may not be near the outside, but
it's hard to see any plants from jail.
okay. Oh, I see. Okay. That's understandable. Well, let's see. Picture yourself on the street outside of Vancouver Community College on Glen. Or any, tree-lined street. We're quite lucky in Vancouver and in the Lower Mainland in general that there is quite a lot of foliage. So is it, let's say, is it 20%, 50%, more than that?
I'd say 10 to 20.
10 to 20? Okay, yeah. I would say that too, something like that. And that is in an urban developed area. So there's even quite a bit of green in an urban developed area. And of course, if you go out of the urban developed area, you'll see nothing but green. So why is that? Why is the world so green? Well, terrestrial herbivores, not just our large herbivores like deer or elk or moose, but also the smaller herbivores, of which there are plenty. So many of the insects we were seeing earlier are herbivores. Some are also carnivores, but a lot are herbivores, and they consume relatively little plant biomass, interestingly, because they're held in check by a variety of factors that the plants themselves exhibit. So plants are actually quite protective of themselves. So a terrestrial ecosystem will have a large standing crop despite large numbers of herbivores. So a standing crop is the amount of biomass at any given time. So here, if we're looking at this entire tract of land, that would be the standing crop. We have to define the area that we're quantifying. So we may just be quantifying this area here, but as the researcher or whatever we're interested in, we define our area and the standing crop in that area. So what are those reasons? Well, plants are quite defensive. What are some of the plant defenses that they exhibit? What are some plant defenses that are quite efficient at avoiding being eaten? What are some plant defenses? You can write that in the chat. Sorry, thorns?
Thorns, yeah.
Good, good. Yeah, thorns, for sure. What's another kind of plant defense?
Toxicity.
Toxicity. Yes, so plants exhibit those, and it reduces the herbivores that can chomp on them. Another factor is nutrients, the availability of. So some organisms, for example, can't digest certain plants. Indeed, it turns out that humans are getting, for whatever reason, less efficient at consuming wheat. Although I'm not really sure about that whole gluten-free thing. I think that there's a little bit of truth in it, but there's also, I think, a little bit of hype in it. Because the gluten-free industry has taken off like crazy. Also, abiotic factors. So herbivores can only live in certain conditions. So, for example, temperature. Herbivores may also be able to exist only where there is a certain amount of water. So water availability. There's also quite a bit of competition between herbivores for plant material. So only a certain number of individuals can be supported by the system. So there's competition because the plants are limiting the particular plants which certain species eat. So intraspecific is within species, and interspecific is between species. And both types of competition exist. So I'd like to look now at the abiotic factors in the atmosphere and how, in the atmosphere and the land, and how they are cycled. And it's really important to understand that to be able to see where we may be overloading the system. And they are called biological and geochemical processes. They move nutrients between organic and inorganic parts of the ecosystem. And organic means carbon-based. Inorganic are your minerals and elements that are not carbon-based. And life on Earth would not exist except for the recycling of essential chemical elements that are required for life. So here's some models. I'm going to be looking at carbon, oxygen, sulfur, and nitrogen. I'm looking at sulfur, not particularly. But these elements in gaseous form occur in the atmosphere and cycle globally. Other elements that are less mobile, that are not gaseous, like phosphorus, for example, potassium and calcium, they cycle on a local level. And I'll show you a few of those. So this is what we mean by sources and sinks. In this diagram, it shows sources as reservoirs. Reservoirs are where on Earth these particular elements are at any given time. So in reservoir A, which I have, by the way, figured out how to make this larger. There, so you can see it better. In reservoir A, well, I can't draw it at the same time, there are organic materials available as nutrients. Living organisms have nutrients, of course, within them, and also detritus, so dead organisms. Their nutrients are available for cycling as well, so they are a reservoir of nutrients. Through fossilization, I wish I could draw on this even if I can't draw on it when it's zoomed in. So fossilization, which occurs over long periods of time, takes organic material, living organisms that have died. Those dead organisms eventually will be decomposed, and all that will be left is carbon in the form of coal or oil or peat. Those are organic materials, but they're unavailable as nutrients in that form. So coal and oil are not available as nutrients. However, if you follow the arrow down to the left to inorganic materials available as nutrients, when they are burned, then the carbon becomes available once again in the form of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere and also in soil and water. So you'll see that there is between reservoir A and reservoir C, there is reciprocal movement from the living organisms through cellular respiration, decomposition, and excretion that releases inorganic materials available as nutrients. From the inorganic materials, through assimilation and photosynthesis, the materials become available to living organisms. So there's a reciprocal recycling there. And between reservoir C and reservoir D, the inorganic materials become unavailable as nutrients in minerals or rocks, and that's through sedimentation. So that also happens over long periods of time, thousands, even millions of years, where sediment gathers and it gets deeper, there's more atmospheric pressure, eventually it becomes sedimentary rock. And then it erodes. The sedimentary rock erodes through wind, rain, and general friction, and it becomes inorganic materials available as nutrients again. So that generally shows reservoirs of elements and the transfer of materials between elements. And all elements cycle between these organic and inorganic reservoirs. These are diagrams of cycles that I encourage you to look at in the text at some point, but for now, they're basic diagrams that show very well how cycling works. So the water cycle, where is water? Well, and this is all very pertinent to looking at how we are affecting these particular reservoirs. So for example, runoff and groundwater. When rain falls, it percolates into soil and it becomes part of groundwater. The water table, you may have heard that expression, is the groundwater, the water that's underground in the soil and below the soil in bedrock. And in Europe, for example, there's so much use of groundwater that the water table has gotten lower and lower. So I don't know, I visited my aunt there quite a long time ago now. It's like 20 years, I think. And in Europe, you can't wash your car just whenever you want. There's restrictions on things like car washing. And it's not normal to take a deep bath. You never take deep baths. You just take, small baths with a little bit of water in the bathtub. So water becomes less available when there is more human habitation. So that groundwater eventually, because of the slope of land, will run into rivers and into the ocean. From the ocean, it will evaporate. Some of that evaporated water will fall as precipitation over the ocean, but some of it, due to wind, will move inland, be transported over land, and it will fall there. There's quite a lot of evapotranspiration, however, from land as well that evaporates into the sky and forms clouds. So that is generally the water cycle. So I don't know if you've ever looked at a map of Egypt, the area of Egypt and Israel, and there are places that are what are known as desertified, where a lot of the trees have been removed, and it's very difficult to reestablish because you've lost the evapotranspiration of the trees and the moisture that goes into the air. So very close by where there are trees, it's very green, and it remains so because the trees are there to evapotranspirate water into the atmosphere and for water to fall back onto Earth. So it's a very important cycle to have vegetation, very important to the water cycle. The carbon cycle is such that there are carbon compounds in water, detritus, and on land. They decompose through the metabolism of bacteria and fungi. And the bacteria and fungi are going through cellular respiration, taking in oxygen, giving off carbon dioxide. So that is a source of carbon dioxide. Through the cellular respiration of detritivores, my, my printing looks terrible on the screen. I'm sorry about that. I'm much better at blackboard printing or whiteboard printing. Okay, anyhow, so where else does it come from? Well, you and I, who are consumers, also experience cellular respiration. We breathe out carbon dioxide from that, of course. Other consumers also contribute. So how does carbon dioxide get into the atmosphere from the burning of fossil fuels? Well, burning is a lot like cellular respiration in that the cellulose in the wood, or even in fossil fuels, the carbon in fossil fuels is burned, and the carbon ends up in the atmosphere as carbon dioxide. So there's carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. How is it taken out of the atmosphere? Through photosynthesis. So photosynthesis takes carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. And here it's showing photosynthesis on land, but so large forests are good sinks for carbon dioxide, but also the ocean and algae and all those and the protists. So all of the photosynthesizers that exist in the ocean there may even be more important than land, than vegetation on land. So sinks for CO2 via photosynthesis. So the cycle is such: photosynthesis, carbon dioxide plus water, and the photosynthesizers produce sugar and oxygen. And we have to quantify that. I sure hope you can read that. So 6 molecules of carbon dioxide, 6 molecules of water in photosynthesis produce sugar. So 1 sugar molecule, C6H12O6, and 6 oxygen molecules, which are released into the atmosphere, the oxygen. Cellular respiration is the opposite. So this is photosynthesis. Cellular respiration goes this way. Plants go through cellular respiration as well, but the photosynthesis outweighs the cellular respiration. So more oxygen is released than the plants use. That's the carbon cycle. So water moves in the global cycle generally by solar energy. It's solar energy that causes winds and currents. The carbon cycle reflects the reciprocal processes of photosynthesis and cellular respiration. I should have waited till this page to write it because there's more room. Okay, so the nitrogen and phosphorus cycles. The nitrogen cycle, I'm not going to go through it step by step, but I just wanted to make the point that there's the gas nitrogen in the atmosphere, not usable to plants, but there's bacteria that convert the nitrogen from the atmosphere into usable nitrates, for example. And those are usable by the plants. Otherwise, nitrogen would not be available to plants. The phosphorus cycle is a little bit different in that the ultimate source of phosphorus is usually the weathering of rocks. So phosphorus is moved into streams and lakes by runoff from weathered rocks. It's taken up by plants, of course, that require plants in the form of phosphates. And sometimes it ends up being rock again through sedimentation. So phosphorus also cycles through the ecosystem. And decomposers turn out to be exceedingly important for nutrient cycling. So there's geological processes. That's a reservoir of abiotic components like nutrients that are available to producers, cycles through the producers and the consumers, and then a lot of those nutrients are recycled back, mainly due to the decomposers. Very important in cycling. The rates of nutrient cycling are variable. They're very variable. Mostly is determined by the rate of decomposition. So if you're in the tropics, for example, in warm in warm regions with high precipitation, decomposition occurs at an alarmingly fast rate. So decomposition is fast. Much faster than in temperate areas with winter months. Because there is no limit for decomposition in tropical areas. It's warm all the time, nothing slows down, nothing has to save its metabolism for the cold winter days. You know, you can almost see things decomposing in the tropics. But what that means, and this is really important, what this means is that the trees, I'll draw them like that because they're not conifers, trees and other vegetation, so trees take up nutrients very quickly from soil because decomposition and plant growth is accelerated or very fast due to almost limitless sun and precipitation. The significance of that is that, therefore, soil is nutrient poor. The nutrients are all in the plants. Not in the soil, because the cycling is so fast there that decomposition of organisms in the soil is very fast, and all those nutrients are taken up right away by the plant. That leaves the soil somewhat nutrient poor. And the importance of that is that at the moment, well, it's been happening actually for quite a long time, there is a tendency to, there is a tendency to burn tropical forests in order to grow crops. This has been going on for quite a long time. It's called slash and burn agriculture. So the significance of this slash and burn agriculture is very short-lived. Because soil is nutrient poor. So the trees are burned, and some of the nutrients from the trees are then released. Crops are grown, but crops can only be grown with the nutrients that are available for maybe 3 to 5 years. It depends. After that, these sites are just abandoned, and people go on to other parts of the forest to burn and grow crops. So it is a very big issue. For some oddball reason, the Brazilian leader has decided that's a good thing for the burning of forests. Our leaders think that cutting down our forest is a good thing. I don't think either of them are a good thing. They're definitely not a good thing, but they need to be controlled and monitored, and in such a way that, of course, it's sustainable. At the moment, it's not sustainable. But I wanted you to know why slash and burn agriculture in the tropics is not a good idea, and why it's not sustainable, and it's not good for society as a whole in the tropics. And mostly I'm talking about, right now I'm talking about South America, that that the forests there have other value other than deforestation for agriculture. So while I was in Bolivia, we looked at selective logging as an alternative to slash and burn agriculture, selective logging. So I went down there and did a study for a summer. So there are alternatives to slash and burn agriculture. They just need to have more research into them. And I found out, being there, that research is not that easy in the tropics. It's not that easy because the resources aren't there, so you have to take everything with you pretty much. And I went down to Bolivia thinking, I'm an ecologist. I'm just started, I'm going to change everything, and show how slash and burn agriculture is not the answer. But once you're in a developing country, I don't know if you've been to a developing country before, but the poverty just like strikes you like a brick. It's like you can't believe that there's such rampant poverty. And then you think, well, the people need to make a living and need to get food somehow. So really, they're just it's an enormous issue. I don't know exactly what the answer is, but there are ways to use a forest without slash and burn agriculture and increasing the economy of the area. So this is an experiment it's called Hubbard Brook, which is an experimental forest in the States. And it shows that nutrient cycling is regulated quite strongly by the vegetation that is there. So this research team constructed a dam. So this is a dam at the site, at the entrance to rivers that flowed out of the watersheds. And the purpose of it was to monitor water and mineral loss. So this is the site here. This is to show the effects of forestry. So not slash and burn agriculture. In this case, the effects of forestry. So, we have biologists and people in general going to South America and saying, oh, don't burn down your forests. It's not good. And we're actually cutting down our forests at a higher rate than they're being burned in other parts of the world. So, we have to be answerable for that too. So to sort of clear up what a watershed is. So say these are rivers flowing downhill somewhere. These are tributaries to the river here. And the watershed is the area of land that contributes water to this outflow. So each of these little tributary areas, they have their own watershed as well. So smaller watersheds that deliver water through groundwater and precipitation to these rivers. So watersheds is something that is talked about quite a lot in ecosystem biology because that's where the water comes from. It goes into specific rivers, and those rivers flow into the ocean eventually. This is largely what my thesis was based on. It was based on watersheds, logging in watersheds, what effect that had on rivers, and how that affected salmon. In this case, this is the Hubbard Brook study, and this is a watershed here that contributes to specific streams that are flowing downhill. And then this is a watershed that had been previously logged and has some regrowth. And here are some watersheds that have not been logged. So both of these watersheds, of course, have creeks that flow down. So the trees in this one valley were cut down and sprayed with herbicides so that there wasn't immediate regrowth. And then the nutrients that flowed downstream and the water that flowed downstream were captured by these weirs. And what was found was that the net losses of water were found to be greater in the disturbed area. So this is the control. This is quite an old study now. It's still very relevant. So that shows the fluctuation of nitrate concentration. And in the forested area, there is a substantial loss of nitrogen. And that's because once the trees are gone, there isn't anything to take the nitrogen up out of the soil. So as a whole, as humans, we do disrupt chemical cycles in the biosphere. So we have an increase, of course, in population. Our activities disrupt trophic structures, energy flow, chemical cycling, and in most parts of the world. How are we doing that? Well, we transport nutrients where they weren't transported before, and we add new materials, some of which are toxic. Agriculture, for example. So when we practice agriculture, which is nothing wrong with agriculture, it's been practiced for a long, long time, and of course people need food, so you have agriculture. But when you remove vegetation from an area and deliver it to the world as food, it doesn't get recycled back into the soil at that location. So that location will always require fertilizers. So therefore, fertilizers will always be required, which come from different parts of the world. So the problem in many places in South America is that after fields are left, it's mainly because people can't afford the fertilizers to continue growing crops in that area generally. So agriculture has quite a big impact on the nitrogen cycle. So fertilizer is used to replace nitrogen, but that can be harmful because it's disruptive of the natural cycling of nitrogen. Yeah, so the critical load of a nutrient is the amount that it can be absorbed by plants and ecosystem without damaging it. So even nutrients that are seemingly useful for plants, if they're there in an overabundance, they get toxic. It's not unlike plants that we might eat. There are substances, for example, I think cyanide. There's cyanide in apples. It's in such teeny tiny quantities that doesn't affect us whatsoever. But if you were to extract the cyanide from the apples and concentrate it, of course, it can be lethal. So if you have a lot of a nutrient, it can be lethal. So there is a critical load. If there's too many nutrients, what happens is not taken up by the plants. It contaminates groundwater and freshwater and marine ecosystems. So one example of that is in Australia. What are we doing for time? I have to hurry. In Australia, sugarcane farms are often close to the ocean, and contribute an excess of nutrients. Sewage runoff contains nutrients, but they contaminate freshwater systems, can result in eutrophication, which we talked about in the beginning, but also change species composition or species loss. Acid precipitation is another way in which we're changing our atmosphere and our groundwater, sometimes through the combustion of fossil fuels, from industry and from vehicles. And that's the main cause of acid precipitation. So there have been a lot of limitations put in place for industry to contribute fossil fuels to the environment. Some ecosystems, particularly in North America and Europe, are downwind from these industrial regions. So for North America, anyway, we're looking at this area here. So that, let's see. So that is Detroit and areas of Ontario that are very concentrated industry. So that tended to contribute to the atmosphere. Things like sulfuric acid, for example, which then falls as precipitation or acid rain, as it's been called. Industry and pollution. So this is a small picture of Ontario, and it turned out, I think it was in the 80s actually, in the 80s, about 75% of Ontario's lakes became biologically dead from acid precipitation. And that's because living organisms have enzymes, and they can only function at particular pH levels. That is how they evolved, to function at particular pH levels. So when you disrupt that, the organisms don't survive. And one thing about this area of Canada is this is all granite. In Florida, for example, the bedrock is limestone. It's already basic, so it can neutralize some of the acid. But in Ontario, there's no limestone, so there's no neutralization of the acid. But there have been lots of limits, no, that's not the word, regulations put into place for pollution, and many, many streams and rivers have recovered. So after regulations and limitations, many lakes recovered. And the same with the limitation of phosphates in detergents. Once that was limited, lakes started to recover, and the cyanobacteria wasn't as successful anymore. So there definitely are ways to alleviate these issues. So the reduction, for example, of sulfur dioxide has gone down considerably. We do release toxins like pesticides and herbicides. Some are synthetic and they're previously unknown to nature. The reason that they can be harmful is because they get concentrated in the food web, going up the food chain. It's called biological magnification. So this is an example of phytoplankton and zooplankton. And the zooplankton will take up the toxin, but not necessarily excrete it. And while the toxin is in the bodies of the zooplankton, the fish eat the zooplankton, but they eat tons of zooplankton. So it gets concentrated in the fishes, and then when birds eat the fishes, it gets concentrated in the birds, and sometimes it affects the egg shells in particular. So biomagnification is what Rachel Carson noticed. So Rachel Carson, she's considered to be the founder of the environmental movement, really. There are several founders, I'm sure, but she was one of the founders. Noticed that songbirds were disappearing. And she investigated it and eventually wrote a book called Silent Spring. Oh, sorry. And discovered that the reason was biomagnification through DDT being added as a pesticide in agriculture. So that is what I'm going to stop at the moment, 5:41. I went on a bit longer than I meant to. I'm sorry about that. But thank you for watching. I'll just stop recording and then